Section 5 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Horace Bird. But now I'm cabined, cribbed, confined, bound into saucy doubts and fears. Macbeth. Horace Bird was by birth and education a gentleman. He was the son of a man of small means but great expectations, and he had been reared to look forward to the day when he should be the possessor of a large income. But his father dying, both means and expectations vanished into thin air, and at the age of 20 young Horace found himself thrown upon the world without income, without business, and, what was still worse, without those habits of industry that serve a man in such an emergency better than friends and often better than money itself. He also had an invalid mother to look after and two young sisters whom he loved with warm and devoted affection. And though by the kindness and forethought of certain relatives he was for a time spared all anxiety on their account, he soon found that some exertion on his part would be necessary to their continued subsistence, and accordingly set about the task of finding suitable employment, with much spirit and no little hope. But a long series of disappointments taught him that young men cannot leap at a bound into a fine salary or even a promising situation, and baffled in every wish, worn out with continued failures, he sank from one state of hope to another, till he was ready to embrace any prospect that would ensure ease and comfort to the helpless beings he so much loved. It was while he was in this condition that Mr. Gryce, a somewhat famous police detective of New York, came upon him, and observing, as he thought, some signs of natural aptitude for fine work, as he called it, in this elegant but decidedly hard-pushed young gentleman, seized upon him with an avidity that can only be explained by this detective's long-cherished desire to ally himself to a man of real refinement and breeding, having, as he privately admitted more than once to certain chosen friends, a strong need of such a person to assist him in certain cases where great houses were to be entered and fine gentlemen, if not fair ladies, subjected to interviews of a delicate and searching nature. To join the police force and be a detective was the last contingency that had occurred to Horace Bird. But men in decidedly straitened circumstances cannot pick and choose too nicely, and after a week of uncertainty and fresh disappointment, he went manfully to his mother and told her of the offer that had been made him. Meeting with less discouragement than he had expected from the broken-down and unhappy woman, he gave himself up to the guiding hand of Mr. Gryce, and before he realized it, was enrolled among the secret members of the New York force. He was not recognized publicly as a detective. His name was not even known to any but the highest officials. He was employed for special purposes, and it was not considered desirable that he should be seen at police headquarters. But being a man of much ability and of a solid, reliable nature, he made his way notwithstanding, and by the time he had been in the service a year, was looked upon as a good fellow and a truly valuable acquisition to the bureau. Indeed, he possessed more than the usual qualifications for his calling. Strange had the fact appeared, not only to himself, but to the few friends acquainted with his secret. In the first place, he possessed much acuteness without betraying it. Of an easy bearing and a polished address, he was a man to please all and alarm none. Yet he always knew what he was about, and what you were about, too, unless indeed you possessed a power of dissimulation much beyond ordinary, when the chances were that his gentlemanly instincts would get in his way, making it impossible for him to believe in a guilt that was too hardy to betray itself and too insensible to shame to blush before the touch of the inquisitor. In the second place, he liked the business, notwithstanding the theories of that social code to which he had once paid deference, notwithstanding the frankness and candor of his own disposition, he found in this pursuit a nice adjustment of cause to effect and effect to cause that at once pleased and satisfied his naturally mathematical mind. He did not acknowledge the fact, not even to himself. On the contrary, he was always threatening that in another month he should look up some new means of livelihood, but the coming month would invariably bring a fresh case before his notice, and then it would be, well, after this matter is probed to the bottom, or when that criminal is made to confess his guilt, till even his little sisters caught the infection and would whisper over their dolls, "Brother Horace is going to be a great man when all the bad and naughty people in the world are put in prison." As a rule, Mr. Byrd was not sent out of town, but on the occasion of Mr. Ferris desiring a man of singular discretion to assist him in certain inquiries connected with the case then on trial in Silby, there happened to be a deficiency of capable men in the bureau, and the superintendent was obliged to respond to the call by sending Mr. Byrd. He did not do it, however, without making the proviso that all public recognition of this officer in his real capacity was to be avoided, and so far the wishes of his superiors had been respected. No one outside the few persons mentioned in the first chapter of this story suspected that the easy, affable, and somewhat distinguished-looking young gentleman who honored the village hotel with his patronage was a secret emissary of the New York police. Mr. Byrd was, of all men, then, the very one to feel the utmost attraction toward, and at the same time the greatest shrinking from, the pursuit of such investigations as were likely to ensue upon the discovery of the mysterious case of murder which had so unexpectedly been presented to his notice. As a professional, he could not fail to experience that quick start of the blood which always follows the recognition of a big affair, while as a gentleman he felt himself recoil from probing into a matter that was blackened by a possibility against which every instinct in his nature rebelled. It was therefore with oddly mingled sensations that he read Mr. Orcutt's letter, and found himself compelled to admit that the coroner had possessed a truer insight than himself into the true cause of Miss Dare's eccentric conduct upon the scene of the tragedy. His main feeling, however, was one of relief. It was such a comfort to think that he could proceed in the case without the dread of stumbling upon a clue that, in some secret and unforeseen way, should connect this imposing woman with a revolting crime, or so he fondly considered. But he had not spent 5 minutes at the railroad station when, in pursuance to the commands of Mr. Ferris, he went to take the train to Monteith before he saw reason again to change his mind. For there among the passengers awaiting the New York express he saw Miss Dare, with a traveling bag upon her arm, and a look on her face that, to say the least, was of most uncommon character in a scene of so much bustle and hurry. She was going away, then, going to leave Silby and its mystery behind her. He was not pleased with the discovery. This sudden departure looked too much like escape, and gave him, notwithstanding the assurance he had received from Mr. Orcutt, an uneasy sense of having tampered with his duty as an officer of justice in thus providing this mysterious young woman with a warning that could lead to a result like this. Yet as he stood at the depot, surveying Miss Dare, in the few minutes they both had to wait, he asked himself over and over again how any thought of her possessing a personal interest in the crime which had just taken place could retain a harbor in his mind. She looked so noble in her quiet aspect of solemn determination, so superior in her young, fresh beauty, a determination that, from the lofty look it imparted, must have its birth in generous emotion, even if her beauty was but the result of a rarely modeled frame and a health of surpassing perfection. He resolved he would think of her no more in that or any other connection, that he would follow the example of her best friend and give his doubts to the wind. And yet such a burr is suspicion, that he no sooner saw a young man approaching her with the evident intention of speaking, than he felt an irresistible desire to hear what she would have to say, and led by this impulse, allowed himself to saunter nearer and nearer the pair, till he stood almost at their backs. The first words he heard were, "How long do you expect to remain in Buffalo, Miss Dare?" To which she replied, "I have no idea whether I shall stay a week or a month." Then the whistle of the advancing train was heard, and the two pressed hurriedly forward. The business which had taken Mr. Byrd to Monteith kept him in that small town all day. But though he missed the opportunity of attending the opening of the inquest at Sibley, he did not experience the vivid disappointment which might have been expected, his interest in that matter having in some unaccountable way subsided from the moment he saw Imogene Dare take the cars for Buffalo. It was 5 o'clock when he again returned to Sibley, the hour at which the western train was also due. In fact, it came steaming in while he stood there, and, as was natural perhaps, he paused a moment to watch the passengers alight. There were not many, and he was about to turn toward home when he saw a lady step upon the platform whose appearance was so familiar that he stopped, disbelieving the evidence of his own senses. Miss Dare returned? Miss Dare, who but a few hours before had left this very depot for the purpose, as she said, of making a visit of more or less length in the distant city of Buffalo. It could not be. And yet there was no mistaking her, disguised though she was by the heavy veil that covered her features. She had come back, and the interest which Mr. Byrd had lost in Sibley and its possible mystery revived with a suddenness that called up a self-conscious blush to his hardy cheek. But why had she so changed her plans? What could have occurred during the few hours that had elapsed since her departure to turn her about on her path and drive her homeward before her journey was half completed? He could not imagine. True, it was not his present business to do so, and yet, however much he endeavored to think of other things, he found this question occupying his whole mind long after his return to the village hotel. She was such a mystery, this woman. It might easily be that she had never intended to go to Buffalo, that she had only spoken of that place as the point of her destination under the stress of her companion's importunities, and that the real place for which she was bound had been some spot very much nearer home. The fact that her baggage had consisted only of a small bag that she carried on her arm would lend probability to this idea. Yet, such was the generous character of the young detective, he hesitated to give credit to this suspicion, and indeed took every pains to disabuse himself of it by inquiring of the ticket agent whether it was true, as he had heard, that Miss Dare had left town on that day for a visit to her friends in Buffalo. He received for his reply that she had bought a ticket for that place, though she evidently had not used it, a fact which seemed at least to prove she was honest in the expression of her intentions that morning, whatever alteration may have taken place in her plans during the course of her journey. Mr. Byrd did not enjoy his supper that night, and was heartily glad when, in a few moments after its completion, Mr. Ferris came in for a chat and a cigar. They had many things to discuss. First, their own case was now drawing to a successful close. Next, the murder of the day before, and lastly, the few facts which had been elicited in regard to that murder, in the inquiry which had that day been begun before the coroner. Of the latter Mr. Ferris spoke with much interest. He had attended the inquest himself, and though he had not much to communicate, the time having been mainly taken up in selecting and swearing in a jury, a few witnesses had been examined and certain conclusions reached, which certainly added greatly to the impression already made upon the public mind that an affair of great importance had arisen, an affair, too, promising more in the way of mystery than the simple nature of its earlier manifestations gave them reason to suppose. In the first place, the widow had evidently been assaulted with a deliberate purpose and a serious intent to slay. Secondly, no immediate testimony was forthcoming calculated to point with unerring certainty to the guilty party. To be sure, the tramp and the hunchback still offered possibilities of suspicion, but even they were slight, the former having been seen to leave the widow's house without entering, and the latter having been proved beyond a question to have come into town on the morning train and to have gone at once to court, where he remained till the time they all saw him disappear down the street. That the last mentioned individual may have had some guilty knowledge of the crime was possible enough. The fact of his having wiped himself out so completely as to elude all search was suspicious in itself. But if he was connected with the assault, it must have been simply as an accomplice, employed to distract public attention from the real criminal, and in a case like this, the interest naturally centers with the actual perpetrator, and the question was now, and must be, who was the man who, in broad daylight, dared to enter a house situated like this in a thickly populated street and kill with a blow an inoffensive woman? "I cannot imagine," declared Mr. Ferris, as his communication reached this point. "It looks as if she had an enemy, but what enemy could such a person as she possess? A woman who always did her own work, attended to her own affairs, and made it an especial rule of her life never to meddle with those of anybody else." "Was she such a woman?" inquired Mr. Byrd, to whom as yet no knowledge had come of the widow's life, habits, or character. "Yes. In all the years I have been in this town, I have never heard of her visiting any one or encouraging any one to visit her. Had it not been for Mr. Orcutt, she would have lived the life of a recluse. As it was, she was the most methodical person in her ways that I ever knew. At just such an hour she rose, at just such an hour put on her kettle, cooked her meal, washed her dishes, sat herself down to her sewing or whatever work it was she had to do. The dinner was the only meal that waited, and that, Mr. Orcutt says, was always ready and done to a turn at whatever moment he chose to present himself." "Had she no intimates, no relatives?" asked Mr. Byrd, remembering that fragment of a letter he had read, a letter which certainly contradicted this assertion in regard to her even and quiet life. "None that I am aware of," was the response. "Wait. I believe I have been told she has a nephew somewhere, a sister's son, for whom she had some regard, and to whom she intended to leave her money." "She had money, then?" "Some 5,000, maybe. Reports differ about such matters." "And this nephew, where does he live?" "I cannot tell you. I don't know as any one can. My remembrances in regard to him are of the vaguest character." $5,000 is regarded as no mean sum in a town like this," quoth Mr. Byrd, carelessly. "I know it. She is called quite rich by many. How she got her money no one knows, for when she first came here she was so poor she had to eat and sleep all in one room. Mr. Orcutt paid her something for his daily dinner, of course, but that could not have enabled her to put $10 in the bank as she has done every week for the last 10 years. And to all appearances she has done nothing else for her living. You see, we have paid attention to her affairs, if she has paid none to ours." Mr. Byrd again remembered that scrap of letter which had been shown him by the coroner, and thought to himself that their knowledge was in all probability less than they supposed. "Who was that horrid crone I saw shouldering herself through the crowd that collected around the gate yesterday?" was his remark. "However, do you remember a wizened, toothless old wretch, whose eye has more of the evil one in it than of many a young thief you see locked up in the county jails." "No, that is, I wonder if you mean Sally Perkins. She is old enough and ugly enough to answer your description, and now I think of it, she has a way of leering at you as you go by that is slightly suggestive of a somewhat bitter knowledge of the world. What makes you ask about her?" "Because she attracted my attention, I suppose. You must remember that I don't know any of these people, and that an especially vicious-looking person like her would be apt to awaken my curiosity." "I see, I see. But in this case I doubt if it leads to much. Old Sally is a hard one, no doubt, but I don't believe she ever contemplated a murder, much less accomplished it. It would take too much courage, to say nothing of strength. It was a man's hand that struck that blow, Mr. Byrd." "Yes," was the quick reply, a reply given somewhat too quickly, perhaps, for it made Mr. Ferris look up inquiringly at the young man. "You take considerable interest in the affair," he remarked shortly. "Well, I do not wonder. Even my old blood has been somewhat fired by its peculiar features. I foresee that your detective instinct will soon lead you to risk a run at the game." "Ah, then, you see no objection to my trying for the scent, if the coroner persists in demanding it?" inquired Mr. Byrd, as he followed the other to the door. "On the contrary," was the polite response. And Mr. Byrd found himself satisfied on that score. Mr. Ferris had no sooner left the room than the coroner came in. "Well," he cried, with no unnecessary delay, "I want you." Mr. Byrd rose. "Have you telegraphed to New York?" he asked. "Yes, and expect an answer every minute. There will be no difficulty about that. The superintendent is my friend, and he will not be likely to cross me in my expressed wish." "But," essayed the detective. "We have no time for buts," broke in the coroner. "The inquest begins in earnest to morrow, and the one witness we most want has not yet been found. I mean the man or the woman who can swear to seeing someone approach or enter the murdered woman's house between the time the milkman left at 11:30 and the hour she was found by Mr. Orcutt lying upon the floor of her dining room in a dying condition. That such a witness exists, I have no doubt. A street in which there are 6 houses, every one of which has to be passed by a person entering Widow Clemmens' gate, must produce one individual at least who can swear to what I want. To be sure, all whom I have questioned so far say that they were either eating dinner at the time or were in the kitchen serving it up. But, for all that, there were plenty who saw the tramp, and 2 women at least, who are ready to take their oath that they not only saw him, but watched him long enough to observe him going round to the Widow Clemmens' kitchen door, and turn about again and come away as if for some reason he had changed his mind about entering. Now, if there were 2 witnesses to see all that, then there must have been one somewhere to notice that other person, known or unknown, who went through the street but a few minutes before the tramp. At all events, I believe such a witness can be found, and I mean to have him if I call up every man, woman, and child who was in the lane at the time. But a little foreknowledge helps a coroner wonderfully, and if you will aid me by making judicious inquiries round about, time will be gained, and perhaps a clue obtained that will lead to direct knowledge of the perpetrator of this crime." "But," inquired the detective, willing at least to discuss the subject with the coroner, "is it absolutely necessary that the murderer should have advanced from the street? Is there no way he could have reached the house from the back, and so have eluded the gaze of the neighbors round about?" "No, that is, there is no regular path there, only a stretch of swampy ground, anything but pleasant to travel through. Of course, a man with a deliberate purpose before him might pursue that route and subject himself to all its inconveniences, but I would scarcely expect it of one who chose such an hour for his assault," the coroner explained. with a slight stammer of embarrassment that did not escape the detective's notice. "Nor shall I feel ready to entertain the idea till it has been proved that no person, with the exception of those already named, was seen at any time during that fatal half hour to advance by the usual way to the widow's house." "Have you questioned the tramp, or in any way received from him an intimation of the reason why he did not go into the house after he came to it?" "He said he heard voices quarrelling." "Aha!" "Of course, he was not upon his oath, but as the statement was volunteered, we have some right to credit it, perhaps." "Did he say it was Mr. Byrd, now, who lost a trifle of his fluency, what sort of voices he heard?" "No, he is an ignorant wretch, and moreover thoroughly frightened. I don't believe he would know a cultivated from an uncultivated voice, a gentleman's from a quarryman's. At all events, we cannot trust to his discrimination." Mr. Byrd started. This was the last construction he had expected to be put upon his question. Flushing a trifle, he looked the coroner earnestly in the face, but that gentleman was too absorbed in the train of thought raised by his own remark to notice the look, and Mr. Byrd, not feeling any too well assured of his own position, forbore to utter the words that hovered on his tongue. "I have another commission for you," resumed the coroner after a moment. "Here is a name which I wish you would look at." But at this instant a smart tap was heard at the door, and a boy entered with the expected telegram from New York. Dr. Tredwell took it, and after glancing at its contents with an annoyed look, folded up the paper he was about to hand to Mr. Byrd, and put it slowly back into his pocket. He then referred again to the telegram. "It is not what I expected," he said, shortly, after a moment of perplexed thought. "It seems that the superintendent is not disposed to accommodate me," and he tossed over the telegram. Mr. Byrd took it and read: "Expect a suitable man by the midnight express. He will bring a letter." A flush mounted to the detective's brow. "You see, sir," he observed, "I was right when I told you I was not the man." "I don't know," returned the other, rising. "I have not changed my opinion. The man they send may be very keen and well up in his business, but I doubt if he will manage this case any better than you would have done," and he moved quietly toward the door. "Thank you for your too favorable opinion of my skill," said Mr. Byrd, as he bowed the other out. "I am sure the superintendent is right. I am not much accustomed to work for myself, and was none too eager to take the case in the first place, as you will do me the justice to remember. I can but feel relieved at this shifting of the responsibility upon shoulders more fitted to bear it." Yet, when the coroner was gone, and he sat down alone by himself to review the matter, he found that he was in reality more disappointed than he cared to confess. Why, he scarcely knew. There was no lessening of the shrinking he had always felt from the possible developments which an earnest inquiry into the causes of this crime might educe. Yet to be severed in this way from all professional interest in the pursuit cut him so deeply that, in despite of his usual good sense and correct judgment, he was never nearer sending in his resignation than he was in that short half hour which followed the departure of Dr. Tredwell. To distract his thoughts, he at last went down to the bar room. Chapter 6. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Skill of an Artist. A hit, a very palpable hit. Hamlet. He found it occupied by some half-dozen men, one of whom immediately attracted his attention by his high-bred air and total absorption in the paper he was reading. He was evidently a stranger, and, though not without some faint marks of a tendency to gentlemanly dissipation, was, to say the least, more than ordinarily good-looking, possessing a large, manly figure and a fair, regular-featured face, above which shone a thick crop of short, curly hair of a peculiarly bright blond color. He was sitting at a small table, drawn somewhat apart from the rest, and was, as I have said, engrossed with the newspaper, to the utter exclusion of any apparent interest in the talk that was going on at the other end of the room. And yet this talk was of the most animated description, and was seemingly of a nature to attract the attention of the most indifferent. At all events, Mr. Byrd considered it so, and after one comprehensive glance at the elegant stranger that took in not only the personal characteristics I have noted, but also the frown of deep thought or anxious care that furrowed a naturally smooth forehead, he passed quietly up the room and took his stand among the group of loungers there assembled. Mr. Byrd was not unknown to the habitués of that place, and no cessation took place in the conversation. They were discussing an occurrence slight enough in itself, but made interesting and dramatic by the unconscious enthusiasm of the chief speaker, a young fellow of indifferent personal appearance, but with a fervid flow of words and a knack at presenting a subject that reminded you of the actor's power, and made you as anxious to watch his gesticulations as to hear the words that accompanied them. "I tell you," he was saying, "that it was just a leaf out of a play. I never saw its equal off the stage. She was so handsome, so impressive in her trouble or anxiety, or whatever it was that agitated her, and he so dark and so determined in his trouble or anxiety, or whatever it was that agitated him. They came in at different doors, she at one side of the depot, and he at another, and they met just where I could see them both, directly in the center of the room. 'You!' was her involuntary cry, and she threw up her hands before her face just as if she had seen a ghost or a demon. An equal exclamation burst from him, but he did not cover his eyes, only stood and looked at her as if he were turned to stone. In another moment she dropped her hands. 'Were you coming to see me?' came from her lips in a whisper so fraught with secret horror and anguish that it curdled my blood to hear it. 'Were you coming to see me?' was his response, uttered in an equally suppressed voice and with an equal intensity of expression. And then, without either giving an answer to the other's question, they both shrank back, and turning, fled with distracted looks, each by the way they had come, the two doors closing with a simultaneous bang that echoed through that miserable depot like a knell. There were not many folks in the room just at that minute, but I tell you those that were looked at each other as they had not done before and would not likely to do again. Some unhappy tragedy underlies such a meeting and parting, gentlemen, and I for one would rather not inquire what." "But the girl, the man, didn't you see them again before you left?" asked an eager voice from the group. "The young lady," remarked the other, "was on the train that brought me here. The gentleman went the other way." "Oh, ah, and where did she get off?" rose in a somewhat deafening clamor around him. "I did not observe. She seemed greatly distressed, if not thoroughly overcome, and observing her pull down her veil, I thought she did not relish my inquiring looks, and as I could not sit within view of her and not watch her, I discreetly betook myself into the smoking car, where I stayed till we arrived at this place." Ha! Curious!" rose in a chorus once more, and then, the general sympathies of the crowd being exhausted, two or three or more of the group sauntered up to the bar, and the rest sidled restlessly out of the room, leaving the enthusiastic speaker alone with Mr. Byrd. "A strange scene!" exclaimed the latter, infusing just enough of seeming interest into his usually nonchalant tone to excite the vanity of the person he addressed, and make him more than ever ready to talk. "I wish I had been in your place," continued Mr. Byrd, almost enthusiastically. "I am sure I could have made a picture of that scene that would have been very telling in the Gazette I draw for." "Do you make pictures for papers?" the young fellow inquired, his respect visibly rising. "Sometimes," the imperturbable detective replied, and in doing so told no more than the truth. He had a rare talent for offhand sketching, and not infrequently made use of it to increase the funds of the family. "Well, that is something I would like to do," acknowledged the youth, surveying the other over with curious eyes. "But I haven't a cent's worth of talent for it. I can see a scene in my mind now, this one, for instance, just as plain as I can see you. All the details of it, you know, the way they stood, the clothes they wore, the looks on their faces, and all that. But when I try to put it on paper, why, I just can't, that's all." "Your forte lies another way," remarked Mr. Byrd. "You can present a scene so vividly that a person who has not seen it for himself might easily put it on paper just from your description. See now," and he caught up a sheet of paper from the desk and carried it to a side table. "Just tell me what depot this was in." The young fellow, greatly interested at once, leaned over the detective's shoulder and eagerly replied, "The depot at Syracuse." Mr. Byrd nodded and made a few strokes with his pencil on the paper before him. "How was the lady dressed?" he next asked. "In blue, dark blue cloth, fitting like a glove. Fine figure, you know. Very tall and unusually large, but perfect. I assure you, perfect. Yes, that is very like it," he went on, watching the quick, assured strokes of the other with growing wonder and an unbounded admiration. "You have caught the exact poise of the heads, as I live. And yes, a large hat with two feathers, sir, two feathers drooping over the side. So. A bag on the arm, two flounces on the skirt. Oh, the face. Well, handsome, sir, very handsome. Straight nose, large eyes, determined mouth, strong, violently agitated expression. Well, I will give up. A photograph couldn't have done her better justice. You are a genius, sir, a genius." Mr. Byrd received this tribute to his skill with some confusion and a deep blush, which he vainly sought to hide by bending lower over his work. "The man now," he suggested, with the least perceptible change in his voice, that, however, escaped the attention of his companion. "What was he like, young or old?" "Well, young, about 25, I should say, medium height, but very firmly and squarely built, with a strong face, large mustache, brilliant eyes, and a look, I cannot describe it, but you have caught that of the lady so well, you will, doubtless, succeed in getting his also." But Mr. Byrd's pencil moved with less certainty now, and it was some time before he could catch even the peculiar sturdy aspect of the figure which made this unknown gentleman, as the young fellow declared, look like a modern Hercules, though he was far from being either large or tall. The face, too, presented difficulties he was far from experiencing in the case of the lady, and the young fellow at his side was obliged to make several suggestions, such as, "A little more hair on the forehead, if you please." "There was quite a lock showing beneath his hat." Or, "A trifle less sharpness to the chin, so." Or, "Stay, you have it too square now. Tone it down a hair's breadth, and you will get it," before he received even the somewhat hesitating acknowledgment from the other of, "There, that is something like him." but he had not expected to succeed very well in this part of the picture, and was sufficiently pleased to have gained a very correct notion of the style of clothing the gentleman wore, which, it is needless to state, was most faithfully reproduced in the sketch, even if the exact expression of the strong and masculine face was not. "A really remarkable bit of work," admitted the young fellow, when the whole was completed, "and as true to the scene, too, as half the illustrations given in the weekly papers. Would you mind letting me have it as a souvenir?" he eagerly inquired. "I would like to show it to a chap who was with me at the time. The likeness to the lady is wonderful." Mr. Byrd, with his most careless air, had already thrust the picture into his pocket, from which he refused to withdraw it, saying, with an easy laugh, that it might come and play with him some time, and that he could not afford to part with it. At which remark the young fellow looked disappointed, and vaguely rattled some coins he had in his pocket, but meeting with no encouragement from the other, forbore to press his request, and turned it into an invitation to join him in a social glass at the bar. To this slight token of appreciation Mr. Byrd did not choose to turn a deaf ear, so the drinks being ordered, he proceeded to clink glasses with the youthful stranger, taking the opportunity at the same time of glancing over to the large, well-built man, whose quiet absorption in the paper he was reading had so attracted his attention when he first came in. To his surprise, he found that person just as engrossed in the news as ever, not a feature or an eyelash appearing to have moved since the time he looked at him last. Mr. Byrd was so astonished at this that when he left the room a few minutes later, he took occasion in passing the gentleman to glance at the paper he was studying so industriously, and to his surprise found it to be nothing more nor less than the advertising sheet of the New York Herald. "A fellow of my own craft," was his instantaneous conclusion, but a moment's consideration assured him that this could not be, as no detective worthy the name would place so little value upon the understanding of those about him as to sit for half an hour with his eyes upon a sheet of paper totally devoid of news, no matter what his purpose might be, or how great was his interest in the conversation to which he was secretly listening. No, this gentleman was doubtless what he seemed to be, a mere stranger with something of a serious and engrossing nature upon his mind, or else he was an amateur who for some reason was acting the part of a detective without either the skill or the experience of one. Whichever theory might be true, this gentleman was a person who at this time and in this place was well worth watching, that is, if a man had any reason for interesting himself in the pursuit of possible clues to the mystery of Mrs. Clemmens' murder. But Mr. Byrd felt he no longer possessed a professional right to such interest. So, leaving behind him this fine-looking gentleman, together with all the inevitable conjectures which the latter's peculiar manner had irresistibly awakened, he proceeded to regain his room and enter upon that contemplation of the picture he had just made, which was naturally demanded by his regard for one of the persons there depicted. It was a vigorous sketch, and the slow blush crept up and dyed Mr. Byrd's forehead as he gazed at it and realized the perfection of the likeness he had drawn of Miss Dare. Yes, that was her form, her face, her expression, her very self. She it was, and no other, who had been the heroine of the strange scene enacted that day in the Syracuse depot, a scene to which, by means of this impromptu sketch, he had now become as nearly a witness as any one could hope for who had not been actually upon the spot. Strange! And he had been so anxious to know what had altered the mind of this lady and sent her back to Sibley before her journey was half completed, had pondered so long and vainly upon the whys and wherefores of an action whose motive he had never expected to understand, but which he now saw suggested in a scene that seriously whetted, if it did not thoroughly satisfy his curiosity. The moment he had chosen to portray was that in which the eyes of the two met, and their first instinctive recoil took place. Turning his attention from the face of the lady and bestowing it upon that of the man, he perceived there the horror and shrinking which he had imprinted so successfully upon hers. That the expression was true, though the countenance was not, he had no doubt. The man, whatever his name, nature, calling, or history, recoiled from a meeting with Imogene Dare as passionately as she did from one with him. Both had started from home with a simultaneous intention of seeking the other, and yet, at the first recognition of this fact, both had started and drawn back as if death rather than life had confronted them in each other's faces. What did it mean? What secret of deep and deadly nature could lie between these two, that a scene of such evident import could take place between them? He dared not think. He could do nothing but gaze upon the figure of the man he had portrayed, and wondered if he would be able to identify the original in case he ever met him. The face was more or less a failure, of course, but the form, the cut of the clothes, the manner of carriage, and the general aspect of strong and puissant manhood which distinguished the whole figure could not be so far from correct but that, with a hint from surrounding circumstances, he would know the man himself when he saw him. At all events, he meant to imprint the possible portrait upon his mind, in case what? Pausing, he asked himself this question with stern determination, and could find no answer. "I will burn the sketch at once, and think of it and her no more," he muttered, half rising. But he did not do it. Some remembrance crossed his mind of what the young fellow downstairs had said about retaining it as a souvenir, and he ended in folding it up and putting it away somewhat carefully in his memorandum book, with a vow that he would leave Sibley and its troublous mystery at the first moment of release that he could possibly obtain. The pang which this decision cost him convinced him that it was indeed high time he did so. End of chapter 6. Section 7 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Miss Furman. I confess with all humility that at times the line of demarcation between truth and fiction is rendered so indefinite and indistinct that I cannot always determine with unerring certainty whether an event really happened to me or whether I only dreamed it. Longfellow. Mr. Byrd, upon waking next morning, found himself disturbed by a great perplexity. Were the words then ringing in his ear real words which he had overheard spoken outside of his door some time during the past night, or were they merely the empty utterances of a more than usual vivid dream? He could not tell. He could remember the very tone of voice in which he fancied them to have been spoken, a tone which he had no difficulty in recognizing as that of the landlord of the hotel, could even recall the faint sounds of bustle which accompanied them, as though the person using them had been showing another person through the hall, but beyond that all was indistinct and dreamlike. The words were these: "Glad to see you back, sir. This murder, following so close upon your visit, must have been a great surprise. A sad occurrence that, sir, a very mysterious one. Hope you have some information to give." "If it is a remembrance, and such words were uttered outside of my door last night," argued the young detective to himself. "The guest who called them forth can be no other than the tall and florid gentleman whom I encountered in the bar room. But is it a remembrance, or only a chimera of my own overwrought brain struggling with a subject it will not let drop? As Shakespeare says, that is the question." Fortunately, it was not one which it behooved him to decide, so for the 20th time he put the subject by and resolved to think of it no more. But perplexities of this kind are not so easily dismissed, and more than once during his hurried and solitary breakfast did he ask himself whether, in case the words were real, he had not found in the landlord of this very hotel the one witness for which the coroner was so diligently seeking. A surprise awaited him after breakfast, in the sudden appearance at his room door of the very gentleman last alluded to. "Ha, Byrd," said he, with cheerful vivacity, "here is a line from the superintendent which may prove interesting to you." And with a complacent smile, Dr. Treadwell handed over a letter which had been brought to him by the detective who had that morning arrived from New York. With a dim sense of foreboding which he would have found difficult to explain, Mr. Byrd opened the note and read the following words: "Dear Sir, I send with this a man fully competent to conduct a case of any ordinary difficulty. I acknowledge it is for our interest that you employ him to the exclusion of the person mentioned in your letter. But if you or that person think that he can render you any real assistance by his interference, he is at liberty to act in his capacity of detective in as far as he can do so without divulging too widely the secret of his connection with the force." "The superintendent need not be concerned," said Mr. Byrd, returning the note with a constrained bow. "I shall not interfere in this matter." "You will miss a good thing, then," remarked the coroner shortly, looking keenly at the young man. "I cannot help it," observed the other, with a quick sigh of impatience or regret. "I should have to see my duty very clearly and possess the very strongest reason for interfering before I presume to offer either advice or assistance after a letter of this kind." "And who knows but what such reasons may yet present themselves?" ventured the coroner. Then, seeing the young man shake his head, made haste to add in the businesslike tone of one preparing to take his leave, "At all events, the matter stands open for the present, and if during the course of to day's inquiry you see fit to change your mind, it will be easy enough for you to notify me." And without waiting for any further remonstrance, he gave a quick nod and passed hastily out. The state of mind in which he left Mr. Byrd was anything but enviable. Not that the young man's former determination to let this matter alone had been in any wise shaken by the unexpected concession on the part of the superintendent, but that the final hint concerning the inquest had aroused his old interest to quite a formidable degree, and, what was worse, had reawakened certain feelings which since last night it had been his most earnest endeavor to subdue. He felt like a man pursued by an implacable fate, and dimly wondered whether he would be allowed to escape before it was too late to save himself from lasting uneasiness, if not lifelong regret. A final stroke of business for Mr. Ferris kept him at the courthouse most of the morning, but his duty in that direction being at an end, he no longer found any excuse for neglecting the task imposed upon him by the coroner. He accordingly proceeded to the cottage where the inquest was being held, and finding each and every available room there packed to its utmost by interested spectators, took up his stand on the outside of a curtained window, where, with but a slight craning of his neck, he could catch a very satisfactory view of the different witnesses as they appeared before the jury. The day was warm, and he was by no means uncomfortable, though he could have wished that the advantages of his position had occasioned less envy in the breast of the impatient crowd that was slowly gathering at his back, or rather, that their sense of these advantages might have been expressed in some more pleasing way than by the various pushes he received from the more or less adventurous spirits who endeavored to raise themselves over his shoulder or insinuate themselves under his arms. The room into which he looked was the sitting room, and it was, so far as he could judge in the first casual glance he threw into it, occupied entirely by strangers. This was a relief. Since it had become his duty to intend this inquiry, he wished to do so with a free mind, unhindered by the watchfulness of those who knew his interest in the affair, or by the presence of persons around whom his own imagination had involuntarily woven a network of suspicion that made his observation of them at once significant and painful. The proceedings were at a standstill when he first came upon the scene. A witness had just stepped aside, who, from the impatient shrugs of many persons present, had evidently added little, if anything, to the testimony already given. Taking advantage of the moment, Mr. Byrd leaned forward and addressed a burly man who sat directly under him. "What have they been doing all morning?" he asked. "Anything important?" "No," was the surly reply. "A score of folks have had their say, but not one of them has told anything worth listening to. Nobody has seen anything. Nobody knows anything. The murderer might have risen up through the floor to deal his blow, and, having given it, sunk back again with the same supernatural claptrap. For all these stupid people seem to know about him." The man had a loud voice, and as he made no attempt to modulate it, his words were heard on all sides. Naturally, many heads were turned toward him, and more than one person looked at him with an amused smile. Indeed, of all the various individuals in his immediate vicinity, only one forbore to take any notice of his remark. This was a heavy, lymphatic, and somewhat abstracted-looking fellow of nondescript appearance, who stood stiff and straight as an exclamation point against the jamb of the doorway that led into the front hall. "But have no facts been obtained, no conclusions reached that would serve to awaken suspicion or put justice on the right track?" pursued Mr. Byrd, lowering his voice in intimation for the other to do the same. But that other was of an obstinate tendency, and his reply rose full and loud. "No, unless it can be considered proved that it is only folly to try and find out who commits a crime in these days. Nothing else has come to light, as far as I can see, and that much we all knew before." A remark of this kind was not calculated to allay the slight inclination to mirth which his former observations had raised, but the coroner, rapping with his gavel on the table at this moment, every other consideration was lost in the natural curiosity which every one felt as to who the next witness would be. But the coroner had something to say before he called for further testimony. "Gentlemen," he remarked in a clear and commanding tone that at once secured attention and awakened interest, "we have spent the morning in examining the persons who live in this street, with a view to ascertaining, if possible, who was in conversation with Mrs. Clemmens at the time the tramp went up to her door. Was it a coincidence, or was there something in the words themselves that called forth the stir that at this moment took place among the people assembled directly before Mr. Byrd? It was of the slightest character, and was merely momentary in its duration. Nevertheless, it attracted his attention, especially as it seemed to have its origin in a portion of the room shut off from his observation by the corner of the wall already alluded to. The coroner proceeded without pause. "The result, as you know, has not been very satisfactory. No one seems to be able to tell us who it was that visited Mrs. Clemmens on that day. I now propose to open another examination of a totally different character, which I hope may be more conclusive in its results. Miss Furman, are you prepared to give your testimony?" Immediately a tall, gaunt, but pleasant-faced woman arose from the dim recesses of the parlor. She was dressed with decency, if not taste, and took her stand before the jury with a ladylike yet perfectly assured air that promised well for the correctness and discretion of her answers. The coroner at once addressed her. "Your full name, madam?" "Emily Letitia Furman, sir." "Emily!" ejaculated Mr. Byrd to himself with a throb of sudden interest. "That is the name of the murdered woman's correspondent." "Your birthplace," pursued the coroner, "and the place of your present residence." "I was born in Danbury, Connecticut," was the reply, "and I am living in Utica, where I support my aged mother by dressmaking." "How are you related to Mrs. Clemmens, the lady who was found murdered here 2 days ago?" "I am her second cousin. Her grandmother and my mother were sisters." "Upon what terms have you always lived, and what can you tell us of her other relatives and connections?" "We have always been friends, and I can tell you all that it is generally known of the 2 or 3 remaining persons of her blood and kindred. They are, first, my mother and myself, who, as I have said before, live in Utica, where I am connected with the dressmaking establishment of Madame Trebelle, and secondly, a nephew of hers, the son of a favorite brother, whom she has always supported, and to whom she has frequently avowed her intention of leaving her accumulated savings." "The name of this gentleman and his place of residence?" "His name is Mansell, Craik Mansell, and he lives in Buffalo, where he has a situation of some trust in the large paper manufactory of Harrison, Goodman, and Chamberlain." "Buffalo?" Mr. Byrd gave an involuntary start, and became, if possible, doubly attentive. The coroner's questions went on. "Do you know this young man?" "Yes, sir. He has been several times to our house in the course of the last 5 years." "What can you tell us of his nature and disposition, as well as of his regard for the woman who proposed to benefit him so materially by her will?" "Well, sir," returned Miss Furman, "it is hard to read the nature and feelings of any man who has much character, and Craik Mansell has a good deal of character. But I have always thought of him a very honest and capable young man, who might do us credit some day if he were allowed to have his own way and not be interfered with too much. As for his feelings toward his aunt, they were doubtless those of gratitude, though I have never heard him express himself in any very affectionate terms toward her, owing, no doubt, to a natural reticence of disposition which has been observable in him from childhood." "You have, however, no reason to believe he cherished any feeling of animosity toward his benefactress?" continued the coroner, somewhat carelessly, "or possessed any inordinate desire after the money she was expected to leave him at her death?" "No, sir. Both having minds of their own, they frequently disagreed, especially on business matters, but there was never any bitterness between them as far as I know, and I never heard him say anything about his expectations one way or the other. He is a man of much natural force, of strong if not violent traits of character, but he has too keen a sense of his own dignity to intimate the existence of desires so discreditable to him." There was something in this reply, and the impartial aspect of the lady delivering it, that was worthy of notice perhaps, and such it would have undoubtedly received from Mr. Byrd at least, if the words she had used in characterizing this person had not struck him so deeply that he forgot to note anything further. "A man of great natural force, of strong if not violent traits of character," he kept repeating to himself. "The description, as I live, of the person whose picture I attempted to draw last night." And ignoring everything else, he waited with almost sickening expectation for the question that would link this nephew of Mrs. Clemmens to either the tragedy itself or to that person still in the background, of whose secret connection with a man of this type he had obtained so curious and accidental a knowledge. But it did not come. With a quiet abandonment of the by no means exhausted topic, which convinced Mr. Byrd that the coroner had plans and suspicions to which the foregoing questions had given no clue, Dr. Tredwell leaned slowly forward, and after surveying the witness with a glance of cautious inquiry, asked in a way to concentrate the attention of all present: "You say that you knew the widow Clemmens well, that you have always been on friendly terms with her, and are acquainted with her affairs. Does that mean you have been made a confidant of her troubles, her responsibilities, and her cares?" "Yes, sir; that is, in as far as she ever made a confidant of any one. Mrs. Clemmens was not of a complaining disposition, neither was she by nature very communicative. Only at rare times did she make mention of herself or her troubles, but when she did, it was invariably to me, sir, or so she used to say, and she was not a woman to deceive you in such matters." "Very well, then, you are in a position to tell us something of her history, and why it is she kept herself so close after she came to this town." But Miss Furman uttered a vigorous disclaimer to this. "No, sir," said she, "I am not. Mrs. Clemmens' history was simple enough, but her reasons for living as she did have never been explained. She was not naturally a quiet woman, and when a girl, was remarkable for her spirits and fondness for company. Has she had any great sorrow since you knew her, any serious loss or disappointment that may have soured her disposition and turned her, as it were, against the world?" "Perhaps. She felt the death of her husband very much; indeed, has never been quite the same since she lost him." "And when was that, if you please?" "Full 15 years ago, sir, just before she came to this town." "Did you know Mr. Clemmens?" "No, sir; none of us knew him. They were married in some small village out West, where he died, well, I think she wrote, a month, if not less, after their marriage. She was inconsolable for a time, and though she consented to come East, refused to take up her abode with any of her relatives, and so settled in this place, where she has remained ever since." The manner of the coroner suddenly changed to one of great impressiveness. "Miss Furman," he now asked, "did it ever strike you that the hermit life she led was due to any fear or apprehension which she may have secretly entertained?" "Sir?" The question was peculiar, and no one wondered at the start which the good woman gave. But what mainly struck Mr. Byrd, and gave to the moment a seeming importance, was the fact that she was not alone in her surprise, or even her expression of it, that the indefinable stir he had before observed had again taken place in the crowd before him, and that this time there was no doubt about it having been occasioned by the movements of a person whose elbow he could just perceive projecting beyond the doorway that led into the hall. But there was no time for speculation as to whom this person might be. The coroner's questions were every moment growing more rapid, and Miss Furman's answers more interesting. "I asked," here the coroner was heard to say, "whether in your intercourse with Mrs. Clemmens you have ever had reason to suppose she was the victim of any secret or personal apprehension that might have caused her to seclude herself as she did? Or let me put it another way. Can you tell me whether you know of any other person besides this nephew of hers who is likely to be benefited by Mrs. Clemmens' death?" "Oh, sir," was the hasty and somewhat excited reply, "You mean young Mr. Hildreth?" The way in which this was said, together with the slight flush of satisfaction or surprise which rose to the coroner's brow, naturally awoke the slumbering excitement of the crowd, and made a small sensation. A low murmur ran through the rooms, amid which Mr. Byrd thought he heard a suppressed but bitter exclamation. He could not be sure of it, however, and had just made up his mind that his ears had deceived him, when his attention was attracted by a shifting in the position of the sturdy, thick-set man who had been leaning against the opposite wall, but who now crossed and took his stand beside the jamb, on the other side of which sat the unknown individual toward whom so many inquiring glances had hitherto been directed. The quietness with which this change was made, and the slight, almost imperceptible alteration in the manner of the person making it, brought a sudden enlightenment to Mr. Byrd, and he at once made up his mind that this dull, abstracted-looking nonentity, leaning with such apparent unconcern against the wall, was the new detective who had been sent up that morning from New York. His curiosity in regard to the identity of the individual round the corner was not lessened by this. Meantime, the coroner had answered the hasty exclamation of the witness by disclaiming the existence of any special meaning of his own, and had furthermore pressed the question as to who this Mr. Hildreth was. She immediately answered, "A gentleman of Toledo, sir, a young man who could only come into his property by the death of Mrs. Clemmens." "How? You have not spoken of any such person as connected with her?" "No," was her steady response, "nor was he so connected by any tie of family or friendship. Indeed, I do not know as they were ever acquainted, or, as for that matter, ever saw each other's faces. The fact to which I allude was simply the result of a will, sir, made by Mr. Hildreth's grandfather." "A will? Explain yourself. I do not understand." "Well, sir, I do not know much about the law, and may make a dozen mistakes in telling you what you wish to know. But what I understand about the matter is this. Mr. Hildreth, the grandfather of the gentleman of whom I have just spoken, having a large property which he wanted to leave in bulk to his grandchildren, their father being a very dissipated and reckless man, made his will in such a way as to prevent its distribution among his heirs till after the death of two persons whom he mentioned by name. Of these two persons, one was the son of his head clerk, a young boy, who sickened and died shortly after Mr. Hildreth himself, and the other my cousin, the poor murdered woman, who was then a little girl visiting the family. I do not know how she came to be chosen by him for this purpose, unless it was that she was particularly round and ruddy as a child, and looked as if she might live for many years." "And the Hildreths? What of them during these years?" "Well, I cannot exactly say, as I never had any acquaintance with them myself, but I know that the father, whose dissipated habits were the cause of this peculiar will tying up the property, died some little time ago. Also one or two of his children, but beyond that I know little, except that the remaining heirs are a young gentleman and one or two young girls, all of the worldliest and most fashionable description." The coroner, who had followed all this with great interest, now asked if she knew the first name of the young gentleman. "Yes," she said, "I do. It is Gouverneur." The coroner gave a satisfied nod, and remarked casually, "It is not a common name," and then, leaning forward, selected a paper from among several that lay on the table before him. "Miss Furman," he inquired, retaining this paper in his hand, "do you know when it was that Mrs. Clemmens first became acquainted with the fact of her name having been made use of in the elder Mr. Hildreth's will?" "Oh, years ago, when she first came of age, I believe." "Was it an occasion of regret to her? Did she ever express herself as sorry for the position in which she stood toward this family?" "Yes, sir, she did." The coroner's face assumed a yet greater gravity, and his manner became more and more impressive. "Can you go a step further and say that she ever acknowledged to herself to have cherished apprehensions of her personal safety during these years of weary waiting on the part of the naturally impatient heirs?" A distressed look crossed the amiable spinster's face as she looked around at the jury with an expression almost deprecatory in its nature. "I scarcely know what answer to give," she hesitatingly declared. "It is a good deal to say that she was apprehensive, but I cannot help remembering that she once told me her peace of mind had left her since she knew there were persons in the world to whom her death would be a matter of rejoicing." "It makes me feel as if I were keeping people out of their rights," she remarked at the same time. "And though it is not my fault, I should not be surprised if some day I had to suffer for it." "Was there ever any communication made to Mrs. Clemmens by persons cognizant of the relation in which she stood to these Hildreths, or any facts or gossip detailed to her concerning them, that would seem to give color to her fears and supply her with any actual grounds for her apprehensions?" "No, only such tales as came to her of their expensive ways of living and somewhat headlong rush into all fashionable freaks and follies." "And Gouverneur Hildreth? Any special gossip in regard to him?" "No." "There are some no's that are equivalent to affirmations. This was one of them." Naturally, the coroner pressed the question. "I must request you to think again," he persisted. Then, with a change of voice, "Are you sure you have never heard anything specially derogatory to this young man, or that Mrs. Clemmens had not?" "I have friends in Toledo who speak of him as the fastest man about town, if that could be called derogatory. As for Mrs. Clemmens, she may have heard as much, and she may have heard more. I cannot say. I know she always frowned when his father's name was mentioned." "Miss Furman," proceeded the coroner, "in the long years in which you have been more or less separated from Mrs. Clemmens, you have, doubtless, kept up a continual, if not frequent, correspondence with her?" "Yes, sir." "Do you think, from the commencement and general tone of this letter, which I found lying half finished on her desk, that it was written and intended for yourself?" Taking the letter from his outstretched hand, she fumbled nervously for her glasses, put them on, and then glanced hurriedly at the sheet, saying as she did so, "There can be no doubt of it. She had no other friend whom she would have been likely to address as 'dear Emily.' Gentlemen of the jury, you have a right to hear the words written by the deceased but a few hours, if not a few minutes, previous to the brutal assault that has led to the present inquiry. Miss Furman, as the letter was intended for yourself, will you be kind enough to read it aloud, after which you will hand it over to the jury?" With a gloomy shake of her head and a certain trembling in her voice that was due, perhaps, as much to the sadness of her task as to any foreboding of the real nature of the words she had to read, she proceeded to comply. "Dear Emily, I don't know why I sit down to write to you to day. I have plenty to do, and morning is no time for indulging in sentimentalities. But I feel strangely lonely and strangely anxious. Nothing goes just to my mind, and somehow the many causes for secret fears which I have always had assume an undue prominence in my mind. It is always so when I am not quite well. In vain I reason with myself, saying that respectable people do not lightly enter into crime. But there are so many to whom my death would be more than welcome that I constantly see myself in the act of being Good heavens!" ejaculated the spinster, dropping the paper from her hand, and looking dismally around upon the assembled faces of the now deeply interested spectators. Seeing her dismay, a man who stood at the right of the coroner, and who seemed to be an officer of the law, quietly advanced, and picking up the paper she had let fall, handed it to the jury. The coroner meanwhile recalled her attention to herself. "Miss Furman," said he, "allow me to put to you one final question, which, though it might not be called a strictly legal one, is surely justified by the gravity of the situation. If Mrs. Clemmens had finished this letter, and you in due course had received it, what conclusion would you have drawn from the words you have just read?" "I could have drawn but one, sir. I should have considered that the solitary life led by my cousin was telling upon her mind." "But these terrors of which she speaks, to what and whom would you have attributed them?" "I don't like to say it, and I don't know as I am justified in saying it, but it would have been impossible for me, under the circumstances, to have thought of any other source for them than the one we have already mentioned." "And that is?" inexorably pursued the coroner. "Mr. Gouverneur Hildreth." Chapter 7. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Thick-Set Man. Springs to catch woodcocks. Hamlet. In the pause that followed, Miss Furman stepped aside, and Mr. Byrd, finding his attention released, stole a glance toward the hallway and its nearly concealed occupant. He found the elbow in agitated movement, and as he looked at it, saw it disappear and a hand project into view, groping for the handkerchief, which was, doubtless, hidden in the hat, which he now perceived standing on the floor in the corner of the doorway. He looked at that hand well. It was large, white, and elegantly formed, and wore a seal ring of conspicuous size upon the little finger. He had scarcely noticed this ring, and wondered if others had seen it too, when the hand plunged into the hat, and drawing out the handkerchief, vanished with it behind the jamb that had already hidden so much from his view. "A fine gentleman's hand, and a fine gentleman's ring," was Mr. Byrd's mental comment, and he was about to glance aside when, to his great astonishment, he saw the hand appear once more with the handkerchief in it, but without the ring which a moment since had made it such a conspicuous mark for his eyes. "Our fine gentleman is becoming frightened," he thought, watching the hand until it dropped the handkerchief back into the hat. "One does not take off a ring in a company like this without good reason." And he threw a quick glance at the man he considered his rival in the detective business. But that worthy was busily engaged in stroking his chin in a feeling way, strongly suggestive of a Fledgerby-like interest in his absent whisker, and, well versed as Mr. Byrd was in the way of his fellow detectives, he found it impossible to tell whether the significant action he had just remarked had escaped the attention of this man or not. Confused, if not confounded, he turned back to the coroner, in a maze of new sensations, among which a growing hope that his own former suspicions had been of a wholly presumptuous character rose predominant. He found that functionary preparing to make a remark. "Gentlemen," said he, "you have listened to the testimony of Mrs. Clemmens' most confidential friend, and heard such explanations as she had to give of the special fears which Mrs. Clemmens acknowledges herself to have entertained in regard to her personal safety. Now, while duly impressing upon you the necessity for not laying too much stress upon the secret apprehensions of a woman living a life of loneliness and seclusion, I still consider it my duty to lay before you another bit of the widow's writing, in which—" Here he was interrupted by the appearance at his side of a man with a telegram in his hand. In the pause which followed his reading of the same, Mr. Byrd, with that sudden impulse of interference which comes upon us all at certain junctures, tore out a leaf from his memorandum book and wrote upon it some half dozen or so words indicative of the advisability of examining the proprietor of the Eastern Hotel as to the name and quality of the several guests entertained by him on the day of the murder, and having signed this communication with his initial letters H.B., looked about for a messenger to carry it to the coroner. He found one in the person of a small boy who was pressing with all his might against his back, and having dispatched him with the note, regained his old position at the window and proceeded to watch, with a growing interest in the drama before him, the result of his interference upon the coroner. He had not long to wait. The boy had no sooner shown himself at the door with the note than Dr. Treadwell laid down the telegram he was perusing and took this new communication. With a slight smile Mr. Byrd was not slow in attributing to its true source. He read the note through, then turned to the officer at his side and gave him some command that sent him from the room. He then took up the slip he was on the point of presenting to the jury at the time he was first interrupted, and continuing his remarks in reference to it, said quietly: "Gentlemen, this paper, which I here pass over to you, was found by me in the recesses of Mrs. Clemmens' desk at the time I examined it for the address of Miss Furman. It was in an envelope that had never been sealed, and was, if I may use the expression, tucked away under a pile of old receipts. The writing is similar to that used in the letter you have just read, and the signature attached to it is Mary Ann Clemmens. Will Mr. Black of the jury read aloud the words he will there find written?" Mr. Black, in whose hands the paper then rested, looked up with a flush and slowly, if not painfully, complied. "I desire," such was the language of the writing before him, "that in case of any sudden or violent death on my part, the authorities should inquire into the possible culpability of a gentleman living in Toledo, Ohio, known by the name of Gouverneur Hildreth. He is a man of no principle, and my distinct conviction is that if such a death should occur to me, it will be entirely due to his efforts to gain possession of property which cannot be at his full disposal until my death. Mary Ann Clemmens, Sibley, New York." "A serious charge," quoth the juryman, breaking the universal silence occasioned by this communication from the dead. "I should think so," echoed the burly man in front of Mr. Byrd. But Mr. Byrd himself and the quiet man who leaned so stiffly and abstractedly against the wall said nothing. Perhaps they found themselves sufficiently engaged in watching that half-seen elbow, which since the reading of this last slip of paper had ceased all movement and remained as stationary as though it had been paralyzed. "A charge which, as yet, is nothing but a charge," observed the coroner. "But evidence is not wanting," he went on, "that Mr. Hildreth is not at home at this present time, but is somewhere in this region, as will be seen by the following telegram from the superintendent of the Toledo police." And he held up to view, not the telegram he had just received, but another which he had taken from among the papers on the table before him. "Party mentioned not in Toledo. Left for the East on midnight train of Wednesday, the 27th instant. When last heard from was in Albany. He has been living fast, and is well known to be in pecuniary difficulties, necessitating a large and immediate amount of money. Further particulars by letter." That gentleman I received last night. Today," he continued, taking up the telegram that had just come in, "the following arrives: Fresh advices. Man you were in search of talked of suicide at his club the other night. Seemed in a desperate way, and said that if something did not soon happen he should be a lost man. Horseflesh and unfortunate speculations have ruined him. They say it will take all he will ultimately receive to pay his debts." And below, "Suspected that he has been in your town." A crisis was approaching round the corner. This, to the skilled eyes of Mr. Byrd, was no longer doubtful. Even if he had not observed the wandering glances cast in that direction by persons who could see the owner of that now immovable elbow, he would have been assured that all was not right, by the alert expression which had now taken the place of the stolid and indifferent look which had hitherto characterized the face of the man he believed to be a detective. A panther about to spring could not have looked more threatening, and the wonder was that there were no more to observe this exciting byplay. Yet the panther did not spring, and the inquiry went on. "The witness I now propose to call," announced the coroner, after a somewhat trying delay, "is the proprietor of the Eastern Hotel. Ah, here he is. Mr. Symonds, have you brought your register for the past week?" "Yes, sir," answered the newcomer, with a good deal of flurry in his manner and an embarrassed look about him, which convinced Mr. Byrd that the words in regard to whose origin he had been so doubtful that morning had been real words and no dream. "Very well, then, submit it, if you please, to the jury, and tell us in the meantime whether you have entertained at your house this week any guest who professed to come from Toledo." "I don't know. I don't remember any such," began the witness in a stammering sort of way. "We have always a great many men from the West stopping at our house, but I don't recollect any special one who registered himself as coming from Toledo." "You, however, always expect your guests to put their name in your book?" "Yes, sir." There was something in the troubled look of the man which aroused the suspicion of the coroner, and he was about to address him with another question when one of the jury, who was looking over the register, spoke up and asked: "Who is this Clement Smith, who writes himself down here as coming from Toledo?" "Smith? Smith?" repeated Symonds, going up to the juryman and looking over his shoulder at the book. "Oh, yes, the gentleman who came yesterday. He—" But at this moment, a slight disturbance occurring in the other room, the witness paused and looked about him with that same embarrassed look before noted. "He is at the hotel now," he added, with an attempt at ease transparent as it was futile. The disturbance to which I have alluded was of a peculiar kind. It was occasioned by the thick-set man making the spring which, for some minutes, he had evidently been meditating. It was not a tragic leap, however, but a decidedly comic one, and had for its end and aim the recovery of a handkerchief which he had taken from his pocket at the moment when the witness uttered the name of Smith, and, by a useless flourish in opening it, flirted from his hand to the floor. At least, so the amused throng interpreted the sudden dive which he made, and the heedless haste that caused him to trip over the gentleman's hat that stood on the floor, causing it to fall and another handkerchief to tumble out. But Mr. Byrd, who had a detective's insight into the whole matter, saw something more than appeared in the profuse apologies which the thick-set man made, and the hurried manner in which he gathered up the handkerchiefs and stood looking at them before returning one to his pocket and the other to its place in the gentleman's hat. Nor was Mr. Byrd at all astonished to observe that the stand which his fellow detective took upon resettling himself was much nearer the unseen gentleman than before, or that in replacing the hat He had taken pains to put it so far to one side that the gentleman would be obliged to rise and come around the corner in order to obtain it. The drift of the questions propounded to the witness at this moment opened his eyes too clearly for him to fail any longer to understand the situation. "Now at the hotel," the coroner was repeating. "And came yesterday? Why, then, did you look so embarrassed when I mentioned his name?" "Oh, well, stammered the man. "Because he was there once before, though his name is not registered but once in the book." "He was? And on what day?" "On Tuesday," asserted the man, with the sudden decision of one who sees it is useless to attempt to keep silence. "The day of the murder?" "Yes, sir." "And why is his name not on the book at that time, if he came to your house and put up?" "Because he did not put up. He merely called in, as it were, and did not take a meal or hire a room." "How did you know, then, that he was there? Did you see him or talk to him?" "Yes, sir." "And what did you say?" "He asked me for directions to a certain house, and I gave them." "Whose house?" "The widow Clemmens, sir." Ah, light at last! The long sought for witness had been found. Coroner and jury brightened visibly, while the assembled crowd gave vent to a deep murmur that must have sounded like a knell of doom, in one pair of ears at least. "He asked you for directions to the house of widow Clemmens? At what time was this?" "About 11:30 in the morning." "The very hour." "And did he leave then?" "Yes, sir, after taking a glass of brandy." "And did you not see him again?" "Not till yesterday, sir." "Ah! And at what time did you see him yesterday?" "At bedtime, sir. He came with other arrivals on the 5 o'clock train, but I was away all the afternoon and did not see him till I went into the bar room in the evening." "Well, and what passed between you then?" "Not much, sir. I asked if he was going to stay with us, and when he said yes, I inquired if he had registered his name. He replied no, at which I pointed to the book, and he wrote his name down and then went upstairs with me to his room." "And is that all? Did you say nothing beyond what you have mentioned? Ask him no questions, or make no allusions to the murder?" "Well, sir, I did make some attempt that way, for I was curious to know what took him to the widow Clemmens' house. But he stumped me so quickly I concluded to hold my tongue and not trouble myself any further about the matter." "And do you mean to say you haven't told any one that an unknown man had been at your house on the morning of the murder inquiring after the widow?" "Yes, sir. I'm a poor man, and believe in keeping out of all sorts of messes. Policy demands that much of me, gentlemen." The look he received from the coroner may have convinced him that policy can be carried too far. "And now," said Dr. Tredwell, "what sort of a man is this Clement Smith?" "He's a gentleman, sir, and not at all the sort of person with whom you would be likely to connect any unpleasant suspicion." The coroner surveyed the hotel keeper somewhat sternly. "We are not talking about suspicions," he cried; then, in a different tone, repeated, "This gentleman, you say, is still at your house?" "Yes, sir, or was at breakfast time. I have not seen him since." "We will have to call Mr. Smith as a witness," declared the coroner, turning to the officer at his side. "Go and see if you cannot bring him as soon as you did Mr. Symonds." But here a voice spoke up full and loud from the other room. "It is not necessary, sir. A witness you will consider more desirable than he is in the building." And a thick-set man showed himself for an instant to the coroner, then, walking back, deliberately laid his hand on the elbow which for so long a time had been the centre of Mr. Byrd's wondering conjectures. In an instant the fine gentlemanly figure of the stranger, whom he had seen the night before in the bar room, appeared with a bound from beyond the jamb, and pausing excitedly before the man, now fully discovered to all around as a detective, asked him, in shaking tones of suppressed terror or rage, what it was he meant. "I will tell you," was the ready assurance, "if you will step out here in view of the coroner and jury." With a glance that for some reason disturbed Mr. Byrd in his newly acquired complacency, the gentleman stalked hurriedly forward and took his stand in the doorway leading into the room occupied by the persons mentioned. "Now," he cried, "what have you to say?" But the detective, who had advanced behind him, still refrained from replying, though he gave a quick look at the coroner, which led that functionary to glance at the hotel keeper and instantly ask, "You know this gentleman?" "It is Mr. Clement Smith." A flush so violent and profuse that even Mr. Byrd could see it from his stand outside the window inundated for an instant the face and neck of the gentleman, but was followed by no words, though the detective at his side waited for an instant before saying, "I think you are mistaken. I should call him now Mr. Gouverneur Hildreth." With a start, and a face grown as suddenly white as it had but an instant before been red, the gentleman turned and surveyed the detective from head to foot, saying in a tone of mock politeness, "And why, if you please? I have never been introduced to you that I remember." "No," rejoined the detective, taking from his pocket the handkerchief which he had previously put there and presenting it to the other with a bow, "but I have read the monogram upon your handkerchief, and it happens to be—" "Enough," interrupted the other, in a stern if not disdainful voice. "I see I have been the victim of espionage." And stepping into the other room, he walked haughtily up to the coroner and exclaimed, "I am Gouverneur Hildreth, and I come from Toledo. Now, what is it you have to say to me?" Chapter 9.